Right, we're on. So this is our second follow-up to the second half of the integumentary system. And we've talked, the first lecture I did about this was just about the skin. The skin is the major part of the integumentary system. We're going to talk mostly today about accessory organs to the skin. Before I get on with the accessory organs, I do want to mention two things that I didn't get to in the first lecture. So let me call it my first whiteboard. And those things are cleavage lines. So these are under the subject of the dermal tissue or dermis, and cleavage lines are separations or less dense areas of dermal tissue. So we have, I'm just going to write separations, less dense tissue. So in the reticular dermis mostly, the collagen fibers are arranged in bundles. And where those bundles sort of separate from each other, where there's less dense tissue, is where we have these cleavage lines, and they're all over the body. And you can see a diagram in your book where these cleavage lines, they tend to lie on certain axes of appendages, or then, for example, the neck and the legs. And they do run patterns sort of on the surface of the skin. We can see some of these cleavage lines from the surface of the skin, not all of them all of the time. And surgeons use these in particular to try to make their cuts and sutures based on cleavage lines. So when a surgeon goes in for a surgical procedure, he or she will usually take a scalpel, knowing where these cleavage lines are, and try to damage as little muscular tissue, particularly skeletal muscle tissue, as possible, because as you know now, skeletal muscle tissue is not very regenerative. So it does help in surgical procedures. Those are a little bit different than these. That's flexure, flexure lines. These are actual creases. They're similar to cleavage lines. These are actual creases or folds that are at or near a joint. I'm going to put comma folds. But they also occur where there's less tissue or less dense tissue. And it's also where dermal tissue is securely tightened or held down to deeper tissue. Classic example of flexure lines would be the creases in the palm of the hand. But we do have other flexure lines around joints as well. So I did want to talk to those. Now we're going to move on to the accessory organs, and that's going to be the remainder of this discussion. When you see that term, just think hair, glands, and nails. Let's start with hair. So hair is considered an accessory organ to the integumentary system. This term or word, P-I-L-I, and it's pronounced pili, that just means hair, that word. So we have hair everywhere on our body. We have millions of hair follicles and millions of hairs. We have them pretty much everywhere, except a few places. Palms, soles of the feet, the nipples, and some areas of the genitals. Everywhere else, we have hair follicles, and there's different types of hair growing from those follicles. I'll explain that in a minute. What hair is basically keratinized cells, not that unlike the epidermis. So, and it grows in a similar fashion. So there are areas to the hair. If I take a hair itself like this, and if this is the level of the skin, and we cut it like we were getting a haircut, and we look at that hair, that slice in a transverse or cross section, there are 3 layers of tissue, and they look somewhat like this. There's a middle portion called the medulla, and that's not specific to hair. That term medulla is often used to describe the center of many organs in the human body. So it just basically means the middle or the center. The medulla is filled with a softer keratinized cell. So I'm going to write soft, keratinized, and it's where we largely find pigmented cells. And the next portion is the largest portion outside of the medulla here, and that is called the cortex. The cortex is, I'm going to put largest volume. And there are also, depending on what source you read, to be honest with you, there are also some pigmented cells here as well. The cells don't always run in the same orientation from the medulla to cortex. I believe the majority of pigmented cells is actually in the medulla, not the cortex, but they're found in both regions. And finally, the outermost region, and I've exaggerated, it's even actually thinner, is called the cuticle. And that is a single layer of cells, so it's very thin, but they are heavily keratinized. They're the toughest cells of the bunch. All right, so that gives us an idea of a little bit about the internal structure of a hair. Now I'm going to draw a hair follicle and label all the parts and pieces to that. So let me call up a new whiteboard. I'm going to call out more colors here. I'll use blue to designate the surface of the epidermis of the skin. And I'll use black to show us an actual hair itself. The term hair follicle actually refers to the cavity or space that the hair grows in. So there's my actual hair. The follicle looks something like this. Now I'm going to draw that wavy line between epidermis and dermis up here. 5 layers of epidermis would be above that line. 2 layers of dermis are below. Notice that the encasement, the sheath around that makes up the edge of the follicle, is epithelial or epidermal tissue. I'll talk about that as soon as I get closer to being finished with some of the major parts of this drawing. So all of this is epidermis, 5 layers of epidermis, and that's epithelial tissue. This business down here is, guess what? That is the papillary dermis up here, which is mostly areolar connective tissue, blood vessels, cells, and then reticular, dense irregular connective tissue, which this is called the reticular dermis. Now you know the layers of the skin. So hair follicles are described as emanating from or penetrating deep down into the reticular dermis, and that's true spatially, but you can see they're walled off from dermal tissue by that blue epithelial sheath. Now this dermal tissue, it comes up at the bottom of the hair bulb here, and this finger-like projection sticks up. And that's significant. That's called the dermal papilla. Let me label some of this stuff now. So this is epidermis, 5 layers of epidermis, which you know is all those tissues are epithelial tissues. This would be, I'm just going to write papillary dermis. This is reticular dermis. This thing right here, which is significant, is called the dermal papilla. Papilla means finger-like projection, and because it's dermal tissue, actually dermal tissue, it's called the dermal papilla. Now, this blue, I've exaggerated the space so that you can see it's different tissue, but this blue covering or coating around that makes up the wall of the follicle is called the epithelial sheath. So it's actually epithelial tissue, and there's two layers to it. There's an internal and external layer to the epithelial sheath. The external layer of that epithelial sheath is derived from epidermal epithelial tissue up here. Okay. The internal layer, which it's still epithelial tissue, but I'm just going to draw a really fine yellow line in here. There's an internal layer to this sheath. It's still epithelial tissue, but it doesn't come from our skin per se. That it doesn't come from the epidermal epithelial layer. It comes from the actual hair growth region itself. And it comes, so let me designate that internal layer of the epithelial sheath is derived from what we call the hair matrix, just like the movie The Matrix, M-A-T-R-I-X. And I haven't even drawn that yet. I'll show you where that is. Before I get to the hair matrix, let me designate different parts of the cell. The part that we see that sticks up outside of the skin is called the shaft. So there's the hair shaft. The part that we can't see down here is referred to as the root, the hair root. And the base part of the root that bulges out right here is called the bulb or hair bulb. So that's the anatomy of the hair itself. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to enlarge, I'm going to magnify this area right here. And I'm going to go to a new whiteboard. So let me draw that magnified. That's the dermal papilla I've drawn that penetrates up into the base of the hair bulb. There's a very special area, it's the area of growth, that occurs on top of that dermal papilla. So right at the top of that dermal papilla is a special area called the hair matrix, and it includes, I'm going to make it a different color. It includes, guess what? Basal stem cells, and you can guess what those are going to do. And it also includes melanocytes. So it's just like the stratum basal of the epidermis. The stem cells are going to give rise to new cells, new hair cells, and they're just keratinized epithelial cells. So let me draw that real fast. These things, I'm just going to draw cellular division. So these are making new cells. And the melanocytes do the same thing. They secrete pigmentation, different types of melanin. Let me designate this whole area as the hair matrix. And we have stem cells, which are highly mitotic. They're dividing all the time. You know that, well, let me take that back, not all the time, in phases. Our hair actually grows in stages or phases, but they are the actively mitotic cells, and we also have melanocytes that secrete pigment, melanin, that give our hair its color. I'll say this now, there's two, I think your book mentions one of the two types of pigments secreted by melanocytes. I don't know why they don't do this in the skin of the epidermal section of this chapter. Anyway, let's just do this. A U melanin is a type of melanin that is just brown, black. It's the dark melanin. And then pheomelanin, Pheo, is lighter colored. It's a yellow orange or yellow red. So you can guess now which type of pigment is being made in people who have darker hair as opposed to people who have lighter hair. And it's just in varying degrees of how much of these two types of melanin are actually being produced and secreted by the melanocytes. So I'm going to flip back to my first picture. So as a hair grows, we know that now that this is the matrix down here. Let me just be consistent and I'll draw it mostly green. And there's some melanocytes in there. So new cells grow, new hair cells grow at the base here, but they die very quickly, not unlike our epidermal cells. And so by the time they're actually where I spot this part of the root, they are actually dead and they're becoming more and more keratinized. They're accumulating that tough fibers. Actually, hair cells are more keratinized than our skin cells. Our skin, you know, your skin is softer than your hair. So the keratinization process is more intense in a hair production. Obviously, by the time we get all the way up to the shaft, they're all dead cells. That's why it doesn't hurt if you get your hair cut. You're just cutting dead cells. And there's no vascularization. There's no innervation. There are no nerves. However, you know, when you get your hair cut, you don't feel anything. But when somebody pulls your hair, you do feel something. So I'm going to flip back to my magnified picture really quickly. Here we go. And in this dermal papilla, we've got blood vessels. And those blood vessels, just like in the papillary dermis of the skin, supply nutrition. I'll put a couple veins in there as well. Supply nutrition, and there are nerves, innervation around, especially around the base of this follicle. It's sometimes referred to, it's a nerve plexus. Plexus. Whenever I see that word, I always just think of it's like a nest of nerves. So that's why it hurts when you have your hair pulled, is you're stimulating these pain receptors in these nerves. And occasionally when we pull a hair all the way, uproot it from the follicle, we can get a drop of blood protruding under the surface of the skin, and that comes from damaging these vessels. Sorry, I meant to have red. Damaging these vessels in the dermal papilla. All right, I think I've covered almost every structure. I'm going to see if my first picture is a little too crowded or if I can fit these. I have two more structures I want to draw in this. So let me just erase a little bit of this dermal tissue if I can do it without erasing a little bit of it back over here. I need to add first a muscle that's connected to the wall of the hair follicle and underneath the surface of the skin, sort of like this. I'm going to draw this structure. That is a small, smooth muscle. It has a name. The name of that muscle is an erector with an A, pili muscle. It's a smooth muscle, And what that means is that it's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. We don't have conscious control over the contractions of that muscle. So the autonomic nervous system controls the contractions of this muscle. They are associated with every hair follicle on the human body. And when they contract, it causes our hair to erect or stand up straight. When they are relaxed, when they're not contracted, the hair tends to sort of lie down like this. And then the erector pili muscle under contraction stands it up straight. Why? What's the purpose of that? Well, first and foremost, it helps with thermoregulation. Think of goosebumps or goose flesh. When you walk outside in February and you have a t-shirt on, you get freezing and it's freezing cold, you get goosebumps all over your body. That is actually a response, an autonomic nervous response. Many or all of the muscles that are attached to these follicles right here are contracting. When the hair stands up, it traps more warm air against the body. It has thermoregulation properties, so it keeps us warm. And this is also a response when we're frightened or threatened. If you've ever had the hair stand up on the back of your neck, that's what's happening. It's more common or more visibly common in other mammals. For example, a cat or a dog that's threatened, you see the hair stand up on their back. That's a threatened response, but it's the same activity that's going on. This erector pili muscle is contracting and causing the hair, particularly in those areas, to stand up. The theory is it makes the animal look bigger and more threatening. So that does it on, let me go back to a new page. Let's grab one right here. Now I'm just gonna label some terms before we start going to our next. VELLUS, vellus hair, is sort of the soft, almost invisible peach fuzz-like hair. It's hardly visible that we have all over our bodies, particularly when we're young. And then as we grow, we lose some of that vellus hair and that turns into what's called terminal hair. Terminal hair is always found. It's developed early in utero and places like the eyebrows, eyelashes, and on the scalp. Then later in life, during puberty, we develop more terminal hair, and that's hormonally driven. So terminal hair, I'm just going to say, then later develops, I'll put in parentheses, puberty, in the axillary region, which is the armpits, pubic region, and in males, the beard region. And many males especially develop terminal type of hair in more places of the body, the chest, and appendages. They lose their peach fuzz type of hair. And women too, especially on their legs, develop terminal hair after puberty. So these are just the two basic classifications of hair types. Before I leave hair altogether, there are growth cycles that I mentioned earlier of our hair follicles. And what we call the growth phase, it's highly variable, by the way. It can last months to years, up to I think even 5 years. A follicle can be in the growth phase. So I'm just going to write months to years. And then most follicles fall into a second phase, which is called the regressive or regression phase. And that's the hair stops growing and the follicle becomes unproductive. That matrix region becomes amitotic during the regressive phase, and the hair cells die, and the follicle sort of degenerates. we almost replace the whole follicle eventually. This can last, this regressive phase, it's variable on an individual, it's variable from follicle to follicle, it's also variable from person to person, but a rough estimate would be like 3 to 6 months. So we're talking about months rather than years for the regressive phase. And finally, there's something called a resting phase. And that's the shortest of all of them. Actually, this one, I apologize. This one I think is the shortest. Let's erase that. I'm sorry if you're taking notes. I'm going to write weeks on regressive phase. These are rough estimates, and the resting phase tends to be a little bit longer. So I'm going to put months after that one. So first, our follicles are in a growth phase, then they reach a regressive phase. That should say, in my opinion, degeneration phase, because that's largely what happens. The cells die and the follicle degenerates. And finally, this resting phase where it almost does nothing. And then the whole process starts again. And we grow new parts to that particular follicle. We almost spit out an old follicle and grow a new one. New whiteboard. Most people know what this word refers to. Alopecia refers to loss of hair or baldness. I think its literal translation might be something like no hair or absence of hair. So it afflicts men more than women. It does afflict both genders, both sexes, but 40% of men, to some degree, by the age of 35, experience some sort of alopecia. And then up to 85% of men experience some form of alopecia by age 60. So it's much more dramatic in men than women. However, as you know, women can lose their hair too. Male pattern baldness is something different. This is in almost all males, period, these statistical numbers. And it's a normal aging process. That's different than something called male pattern baldness, which some males exhibit. And that's a genetic influence. It's inherited. It's called a sex-linked trait, which just means it's on either the X or Y chromosome. In this case, it's on the X chromosome. Sex-linked means chromosomes. Our sex chromosomes are just our X and our Y chromosomes. And sex-linked are traits that are linked to those chromosomes in particular. So I'm just going to put this resides on the X chromosome. They're called sex-linked traits because it's our X and Y that determine our sex. This is a genetically inherited, I don't really affliction or abnormality that here's what happens. A gene actually gets turned on. So a gene turns on somewhere in adulthood, and this affects males. So I'm just going to draw the male sign there. And it changes the follicle's response to testosterone. Changes the hair follicle's response to what's called DHT, which stands for dihydrotestosterone. It's just a form of testosterone. So what happens is this largely shortens the cycle, the time of the growth cycle of the follicle. And it can shorten it to a degree where literally no growth occurs at all. And one of the treatments for this, which can be successful, is to remove testosterone or testosterone blockers from the system. But the byproduct of that is it eliminates sex drive in males. And so most males don't opt for that over losing some hair. But there are treatments, and now there are drugs that actually are somewhat effective at treating this type of affliction. All right, I'm gonna switch topics here now and leave the hair and the hair follicle and go to glands, particularly sweat glands. I'm trying to get in as much of this as I can. Those are, I'm trying to write, it's difficult on this glass board. They're called sudoriferous glands. And they pretty much cover the entire body. So we find them everywhere except for the nipples and external genitalia. But in this case, unlike hair follicles, in this case, the palms and the soles are particularly dense with these glands. So particularly palms and soles. Well, there are different types of sudoriferous glands. The first one that I'm going to list are particularly prevalent on the palms and soles. We have roughly 3 million all over our body. So they're found almost everywhere. And there's two main types. Number one, the first one are eccrine, E-C-C-R-I-N-E. Eccrine sweat glands. These are by far the most abundant or most common. They are merocrine in secretion physiology. That means the cell releases its secretion and is not damaged in the process, can be used over and over again. We have a high concentration of these on the palms and soles. These are the ones. But they're also found everywhere in high concentration on the forehead as well. The secretion that is released is mostly water. So I'm just going to write secretion, 99% H2O, but there are other things worth mentioning in the secretion. Some vitamin C, some salts, inorganic salts, antibodies are secreted by our eccrine sweat gland. Something called dermacidin, which is an antimicrobial, antibacterial agent. Really what it is it's a peptide, which means a small, really small protein. Just a peptide, amino acid chain is a peptide. So a peptide, I'm going to write antimicrobial. Think of that as antibacterial mostly. And some degree of waste products are found in here, although it's minimal. Things like urea, uric acid. The vast majority of those waste products are filtered out and secreted in our urine by the kidney, but some of it is there. And finally, this stuff is slightly acidic. So less than 7.0 on the pH scale. Last thing I'm going to say about these eccrine glands, I'm going to put a star down here. They are regulated by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. I don't expect you to know what all of that means per se in detail, but I'm just going to write sympathetic nervous system. For now, just think It's not under conscious control, and it's typically, again, the sympathetic system gets kicked on when we are stressed out. Sorry, this sweat is mostly, its function is thermoregulation. So the sweating process is effective at lowering body temperature because the physical process of evaporation causes cooling of that surface. So that's the whole reason why we sweat. Our internal body temperature rises, the sympathetic nervous system kicks on these sweat glands, and we start to secrete this watery-based sweat. And when it hits the surface of our bodies, of our skin, when it evaporates, that's a cooling process. And so it cools the body, hence the term thermoregulation. All right, second type of sudoriferous or sweat gland are apocrine. They're both sweat glands. Apocrine sweat glands are in much less numbers. Instead of about 3 million, I think we have about 2,000. So you can see the difference, it's over tenfold. Apocrine sweat glands are found in very specific areas too. The axillary region, which means armpit, and the genital region. They're associated with pubic hair. So really quickly, before I continue giving you fun facts about apocrine glands, if this is the surface of the skin, and I'm going to quickly draw a hair follicle, these apocrine glands are associated with hair follicles. So we need to have a hair follicle present. Here's a typical eccrine sweat gland, not associated with the hair follicle. It's this coil. The secretory cells are down here where I'm running my pen right now, and then the duct leads to the surface of the skin. So this would be eccrine. The apocrine glands look like eccrine glands when we first look at them. They have a secretion area. They're usually cuboidal cells. But then the duct is associated with a hair follicle. That's how we visually tell the difference between the two. Functionally, they're slightly different, and their constituents in the actual secretion are different as well. So, well, let's just continue. These are also merocrine, means the secretory cells do not get damaged during secretion. The ducts actually empty into a hair follicle right here. It has the same watery base as an eccrine sweat gland. I'm going to write same secretion as eccrine, but this is important. There's an addition. I'm trying to write the word additional. Lipids and proteins are also found in the secretion. It gives it a different color, different consistency. The sweat from these glands tends to be slightly more viscous and kind of an off-white to yellowish color. When these lipids and proteins are metabolized by bacteria on the surface of our skin, that gives us body odor. When metabolized by bacteria, that's surface bacteria on our skin, that's what produces the odor that we smell. So the secretion at first, when it is actually secreted, is odorless, just like the eccrine sweat gland. And it's the job of the bacteria metabolizing these lipids and proteins that actually causes that unpleasant odor. these become active at puberty. And what that tells us is it is actually steroid hormones called androgens that turn these on. Because we have steroid hormones that are released in great quantities during puberty. So steroid hormones, I'm going to put in parentheses, androgens. Turn on during puberty. So these are also activated by the sympathetic nervous system. So similar innervation. Here's the deal, though. They are slightly different. I'm going to go back to my previous page so that I can make a comparison. On these eccrine glands, the main function is thermoregulation. The main function of these are not thermoregulation. It's what we call emotional sweating. So I'm going to write not. They do not have a thermoregulation function, that cooling process. These are what we call, some books call these emotional perspiration. Both are controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. But think of these when we get nervous. When we get nervous, we typically start to sweat in the places where apocrine glands are found. And their purpose is not necessarily to cool the body per se. It's more of an emotional response, a stress response. I'm going to go to a third type of sudoriferous gland, and it's a special type. Number 1 and 2 are the most predominant. Number 1 by far, the eccrine glands, number-wise, and number 2 in the areas that I just described. And the third type, so I'm going to write in number 3, are called ceruminous, I-N-O-U-S. Ceruminous glands are still considered sweat glands. So they're still sudiferous glands. It's harder for me to write up at the top of this board than down at the bottom. So they're still sweat glands. They are found only in the outer ear. And they secrete a substance called cerumen. That's where they get their name. This is a thick, lipid-based, waxy type of secretion. And this stuff usually mixes with sebaceous gland, which I haven't gone over yet. I'm doing those last. Mixes with sebum from a sebaceous gland and gives us what we call earwax. Earwax has a protective function. It helps keep fungal growth down in that area, in the ear, that canal that goes into our skull. So it helps keep fungal growth down. It's antibacterial. It helps things. It traps things that get into our ear. And it also has a waterproofing type of capability. When we go into, say, a pool or the ocean, it helps keep water. It's not completely preventative, but it helps keep the water penetration down as well. So it has a major protective function for that area. We say that these are really modified apocrine glands. That's really what they're considered. Mammary glands are also, I'm not going to ask you about mammary glands on this next quiz. They are a type of sweat gland, but they are covered in great detail in A&P2 in the female reproductive system. So I just wanted to tell you that mammary glands technically are classified as sweat glands, sudoriferous glands, and they're a special type. But I'm not going to bring that up on this next quiz because when you take A&P2, you will be asked about those in great detail. Oh, how are we doing on time? Pretty good. So I'm going to hit sebaceous glands and then talk about the overall functions of the integumentary system, and we should be done. These are not sweat glands. They're not sudoriferous glands. They're special oil glands. I'm going to go all the way back to my picture here and draw one for you really quick. Sebaceous glands are associated with hair, well, with few exceptions, they're associated with hair follicles. So over 99% of the sebaceous glands that we have on the human body are all associated with the hair follicle. This sort of cloverleaf or cloud area down here, that's the cells secreting, the simple cuboidal cells that secrete the substance, and then it travels through a duct and it empties into the hair follicle itself. So this would be a sebaceous gland. Now let's go back. So these are considered oil glands, and the stuff that they secrete is called sebum, which is lipid-based product, oil-based or lipid-based. These are not merocrine, these are holocrine glands, and we learned that in, I believe, in the tissue section. Holocrine glands mean that the cells, the secretory cells, actually rupture and are destroyed during the secretion process. So we have to make new cells after secretion. Our glands need to make new cells after the secretion is released. Very few of them empty directly onto the surface of the skin, but some of them do. They're found everywhere except the palms and the soles because they're associated with hair follicles and some parts of the genitalia. They're in high numbers or high concentration. And the glands themselves tend to be larger in these particular areas of the body. The chest, neck, the face. The glands themselves tend to be smaller on the appendages. On our arms and legs. So we know that the cells burst when they secrete. That makes them holocrine glands in function. And that erector pili muscle that we identified earlier may help in the secretory process when those muscles contract. Okay, I'm going to review the major functions of the skin now. So I'm just calling up a whole new set of whiteboards. The sun's shining in my eyes. This is major functions of the integumentary system as a whole. Not just the skin. we've mentioned a lot of these, but sometimes it's nice just to have a laundry list. So first and foremost is protection, and that encompasses a lot of things. It's a loaded word. So, but first and foremost, the integumentary system is a protective barrier. So I'm just going to list types of barriers. I think this is the order of your book. It provides a chemical barrier. That just means that the secretions that come out of the skin are typically acidic. Melanin is also a protective chemical. It's a secretion that protects our bodies from our cells from UV damage. This chemical barrier helps control bacteria buildup on the skin itself. And defensins, which are chemical that is secreted by the skin, are also antimicrobial. I'm going to write 2, a physical barrier. That's the easiest one to picture and understand. Protects us against bumps, abrasion, physical contact with things. So it's a protective barrier. It also is under physical barrier would be things like the glycolipids in the stratum granulosum of the epidermis, provide for a waterproofing barrier as well. And so it helps keep water out and fluid in, prevents desiccation. And number 3, some of the chemical stuff I mentioned are considered biologics, but I'm going to write biological barrier. I believe this is the way the Marie textbook lists this stuff. Specific biological barriers would be like immune cells, intraepidermal macrophages, which are called dendritic cells. I believe I mentioned those when we talked about the skin. They're just immune cells. We find macrophages deep in the dermis, specific macrophages, and DNA converts UV radiation into heat. So there are electrons in the DNA that convert the heat of UV radiation into heat, so providing a biological barrier as well. So we've got protection. Number 2, thermoregulation, or temperature regulation. Largely how this is done is by cooling and heating. I'm just going to write those 2 words. Cooling is done through the process of sweating and also vasodilation. So when the process of sweating now, it's sympathetic response, nervous system response when the body temperature goes up, those eccrine sweat glands. That's this one. Vasodilation refers to this. On the surface of near the surface of our skin are vessels, blood vessels, particularly in the papillary dermis and reticular dermis. When our body temperature increases, when we are hot, say you're out exercising, these vessels dilate closest to the surface of the body. The diameter of the vessels get bigger. That increases blood flow in this area, and heat is dissipated, is released from the surface of the skin. So that's another cooling process. And we also have heating. It's not quite as dramatic by the skin, but this just refers to when we are in a cold environment, these vessels that I just mentioned, they're constricted and blood flow is restricted from this area, and that conserves heat. I'm going to write conserves heat through vasoconstriction. All right, so we've got protection, thermoregulation. Number 3 is sensation. We'll talk a lot more about sensation when we actually do the nervous system, but there are exteroceptors, that just means a type of nerve receptor, sensory receptor in the skin. They're coiled nerve endings near the surface of the skin that are tactile. So we have touch receptors, we have deep pressure receptors. We have thermoreceptors. So I'm going to write warm and cool. So we get all sorts of different types of sensation from those. Don't forget pain receptors. Some deep pressure receptors are also pain receptors, but there are specific pain receptors in the skin as well. Number 4, metabolic functions. Remember, the word metabolism just means chemical reactions. So I haven't mentioned this yet, from UV light, from the sun, some of you may have heard that we synthesize vitamin D in the skin. That's kind of true. Here's really what happens. UV light causes the skin to synthesize, it's a conversion, a vitamin D precursor, a hormone, and it's called cholecalciferol. This is actually a hormone. It's a cholesterol-based hormone, hence the last -ol at the end. So here's really what happens. When UV light from the sun hits our skin, this hormone is produced. It's not vitamin D yet. This hormone then goes to the kidneys where it's converted to something called calcitriol. That is vitamin D. The short story is we need sunlight hitting our skin in order to produce vitamin D in the body. We don't always get enough sunlight to do that, and there are certain diseases or problems, abnormalities that prevent that pathway from happening, which is why some of our foods are supplemented with vitamin D, like milk and dairy products, because sometimes we don't get enough sunlight to make enough vitamin D. But that's the real process. Under metabolic function, the skin can also convert cortisone to hydrocortisone. To help inflammation. So this is an anti-inflammatory process. Hydrocortisone, as you probably know, is an anti-inflammatory. Number 5, there's just 6 and then I'm finished. Number 5 is the skin or the integumentary system can act as a blood reservoir. That's supposed to be an S. All this means is that 5 to 8%, I think up to 8% of the body's blood, the cardiovascular system's blood, is in the skin at any one time. And so it can be used for all different purposes. I'm going to give you an extreme purpose. If you start to bleed, blood loss is a life-threatening situation, as you know, and that 5 to 8% of blood that is in the skin circulating at any given time can be used as a reservoir for life-saving purposes. And finally, number 6, this is somewhat minor, but it's worth mentioning. The integumentary system may act as some excretory processes. So it can excrete small amounts of nitrogenous waste like ammonia, urea, uric acid. By and large, the vast majority of that stuff is filtered and then excreted by the kidneys in our urine. Also, some sodium ions, chloride ions in the form of those salts, and water. So it helps a little bit can help with water balance as well. All right, guys, I am finished for the day. I'm going to cut off my recording and then say a few things.